Has the world forgotten Afghanistan? The country has fallen out of the headlines but remains one of the planet's worst humanitarian crises. Most of the population lives in poverty, and children are bearing the brunt of the suffering. The Taliban remains unrecognized, but is the international community doing enough to help civilians? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Afghanistan. Well, it's been almost 2 years since the U.S. ended its occupation of Afghanistan, allowing the Taliban to take power. Since then, a fifth of the country's economic output has collapsed. Before August 2021, 75% of Afghanistan's economy was dependent on foreign aid. But after the Taliban takeover, most of that assistance dried up. Speaking at a conference in Doha earlier this month, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres explained just how dire the situation has become.
Our humanitarian response plan, seeking $4.6 billion has received a mere $294 million, 64% of the total, 6.4% of the total funding required.
That lack of funding has left over 2/3 of Afghanistan's population food insecure. Nearly 20 million people face severe hunger. Despite the dire situation, the plight of Afghans seems to garner less international attention every day. In a recent report, the UN says it's facing two vital but seemingly incompatible responsibilities in Afghanistan: keeping aid flowing to those most in need while maintaining pressure on the Taliban to end its human rights violations. And while aid workers try to help as many people as possible, children are still the hardest hit.
Today, an estimated 90% of Afghans are on the brink of poverty. Children bear the brunt of it. 2.3 million children are expected to face acute malnutrition in 2023. 875,000 of them need treatment for severe acute malnutrition, a life-threatening condition. Preliminary data suggests that between January and March this year, 134 children were either killed or maimed by explosive devices. This is the reality of the escalating danger faced by Afghan children as they explore areas that were previously inaccessible due to fighting. Many of those killed and maimed are children collecting scrap metal to sell. Because that's what poverty does. It compels you to send your children to work.
Well, joining me now to talk more about what Afghan civilians are up against is Richard Trenchard, representative of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization and country director for Afghanistan. He joins us now from Kabul. Thanks so much for being with us. You think it can't get worse until it does. So from what you have seen on the ground, how bad is it now for Afghan civilians, especially for those children?
Look, Afghanistan remains one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. At the start of the year, we estimated that some 28 million people out of 40 million were in need of humanitarian assistance across all the sectors, from health, education, obviously agriculture, food assistance. Just yesterday, I was in Maidan Wardok. That's a province about an hour and a half, 2 hours outside Kabul, an area that's been ravaged by fighting for the last 20 years, an area that depends on agriculture that in the last 2 years has seen a heavy drought. The situation still remains difficult, but there are signs of improvement, partly because the drought is coming to an end, thankfully, partly because of the enormous amount of humanitarian assistance that's gone in the last year or so, but also because the farmers continue to work, they continue to grow food, and we're just seeing now, I think, a slight change in the direction of the crisis. For the last year and a half, it's been getting worse and worse, and now we're starting to see some slight, small improvement. So there is hope going forward, but the situation in the country's towns and the cities and also in the rural areas, remembering that 70% of Afghans live in rural areas depending on agriculture, it still remains difficult. But there are signs of slow improvement.
Well, that is good to hear. I mean, tell me, was there any sense of relief, really, to have gotten through the winter that everyone was so frightened of? Or is there another set of potential problems coming in the summer? I mean, you mentioned the drought, at least in one province. The worst seemed to be over. But now with summer coming, we're hearing about potential locust infestations that could also destroy some food supplies.
Yeah, it does feel relentless. This winter was particularly harsh, the worst we've had for a few years. Here in Kabul, it was 15, 17 degrees below freezing. And in the higher mountainous areas of the country, it was minus 25, minus 30. It was really tough. And what was particularly hard is that after winter had seemingly ended, we then had another absolutely exceptional cold spell. And we saw lots and lots of livestock, which were deeply affected by this cold spell, and we saw lots of livestock deaths. That passed, spring came, but then what happened is we found up in the north and the northeast part of the country, that's the country's breadbasket. 35% of all the food, particularly wheat, is grown in that area. And we had the signs of a large locust outbreak, the Moroccan locust. The last two big outbreaks here, 40 years ago and 20 years ago, devastated food production. This year, there's been a massive emergency response by us, by also the local authorities and also communities. Hopefully that the impact will not be so bad, but it does feel relentless at times, certainly.
Right, and the unpredictability of climate change just makes your job all that much harder. But I also wanted to ask you about, right now, we talked about the adverse effects on particularly children, but there are also the adverse effects of this new government's treatment of women and girls that are now being kept out of school, girls in particular, women being kept away from work, kind of left to languish in many senses. How is that affecting the social landscape in Afghanistan and the aid deliveries that are so desperately needed?
There have been some edicts this year, starting on the 24th of December last year, when the authorities banned women from working, Afghan women from working for NGOs, and then more recently for the UN. Women play an absolutely vital role in the delivery of all forms of assistance, whether it's here in Afghanistan or any other country in the world. And that certainly had an impact on our ability to reach Afghan people most in need. And this is why we continue to hope that the decrees, the ban, will be reversed, so we can carry on reaching the people, particularly the women of Afghanistan, in pragmatic and safe and principled ways.
How hopeful are you that those edicts will change?
I'm not a politician, I'm a technician, so we spend all of our time this year. We're hoping to reach 8 million people. That's men and women. Some of our programs are particularly focused on women, such as livestock, such as poultry, such as vegetable seeds. At the moment, we are carrying on. There's been a negative impact on our ability to reach those people, but our incredible national and international NGO partners are continuing to find ways of delivering to reach those people who desperately need this assistance, so they can grow food for their families and for their communities.
I mean, as a technician then, are there any easier solutions here to try at least to better deliver aid and to get what's needed to those most in need? Or is the challenge just really across the board? There's nothing easy to be done?
I mean, the word easy is not something one associates with large-scale humanitarian operations here or in any other country. There's enormous challenges every single day when you are trying to deliver such large amounts of assistance across so many sectors to people. There are, as I said, positive signs. The end of the drought, without doubt, for us in the agricultural sector, remembering that, say, 70% of Afghans live in rural areas, that is making things easier because at least now farmers can continue to grow food for their families and communities. The other issue as well is that we know that humanitarian assistance is vitally important in a crisis like this, but also it's not a solution. What we hope for, what we also need, and it's also what the farmers know, is also longer term support as well for irrigation, for market development, for all these sorts of things as well, and also to help Afghanistan respond, mitigate, even adapt to climate change. Everywhere you go in Afghanistan, you see the impacts, you feel the impacts of climate change. Farmers know about it, everybody knows about it.
Right. You know, we opened this program asking the question, has the world forgotten about Afghanistan? Do you think that's an issue here, or has the world maybe just really run out of options on how much it can help?
I think there are, at the moment, as we know, across the world, so many crises, so many challenges that people are facing. Certainly last year, we saw an incredibly large, generous amount of support, assistance, funding coming in for the humanitarian community here. This year, without doubt, it's dropped down quite significantly. Resources are coming in. FAO's work and the work of our other partners in this sector are being supported, but at a level that's much lower than last year. The cause of that, I'm not one to answer, but there are resources coming in, but it's clear that we need to sustain that. At the moment, compared to this time last year, we, the humanitarian community, we were some 50% funded. This year, we're halfway through the year almost, and it's only 8 to 9% funded. So there is a large resource gap, without doubt.
Okay, Richard Trenchard, we will have to leave it there. Really, thank you so much for being with us from Kabul. We greatly appreciate it. Well, let's speak further now about the political conditions in Afghanistan and whether there is any real hope for the country to integrate with the wider world. Joining me now from Bishkek is Wajiha Timuri. She is a lawyer and former Afghan Central Bank legal advisor. From Islamabad, Imtiaz Gul. He is an author, correspondent, and analyst. And from Stuttgart, Emran Feroz is a journalist and the founder of Drone Memorial. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, some argue that it is not the world that has forgotten Afghanistan. It's that there's nothing the world can do now for Afghanistan because the Taliban is what it is. Wajiha, what do you think?
Thank you for having me here today for the panel discussion. With regards to your question, I would like to say that the condition in Afghanistan is not in a situation that the world should leave Afghanistan alone. Afghanistan is an important country for the world from a geopolitical point of view. But when it's coming to the present time that Taliban is ruling Afghanistan or the de facto government that we are having now, it has somehow changed the perspective of the world towards Afghanistan or the country which is underdeveloped. Taliban is a terrorist group, and most of their top leaders or ministers or the people who are governing the Afghanistan government are the blacklisted people in the UN list and US. But now when we are seeing that they are ruling Afghanistan, there is no reaction toward them. Now it's not the time that the world should say, okay, the Taliban are not hearing to us, let's stay aside. However, we can see that in the past 1.5 years, all the things, all discussions, all the negotiations, all the conferences which were held in Afghanistan were in a format of a hypo or hypothesis or a theme. Nothing really happened or nothing really changed. Even though afterward of each negotiation, we saw that the condition is getting worse and worse day by day. For instance, we were witness of the UN representative Amina Mohammed visiting Afghanistan. We saw that the Taliban top delegation denied to visit her. And after when she left, she was like somehow open for some new negotiation or some types of recognition for Taliban, which faced very harsh reaction by Afghan member or Afghan leaders which are living abroad. It means not political leaders. Or based on the recent statement, the Taliban issued, they said that by virtue of the human rights, the international people or international politicians cannot interfere into the domestic affairs of Afghanistan. It's not the time to say that let Afghanistan stay aside. Let Afghanistan deal with what's going on with them. No, it was not the choice of Afghan people that Taliban should come. Everything started from the Doha Agreement from the February 2020. The US started this negotiations and put people in this condition.
Understood, but we are where we are now. What exactly would you like to see the international community do?
So what I exactly expect or what people are expecting from international community is that it is the time to stand with people. It is the time to try different ways, not only getting stuck in negotiations or saying that, okay, we have humanitarian crisis, we are sending humanitarian aid. So let the people what they are doing or what they are suffering. It has been 1.5 years that we are seeing that girls are not going to schools. Higher education is banned for them. They cannot go forward. We are having this gender apartheid, which is very critical or the kind of disasters that people are facing. Or we're having this issue of employment that women are not allowed to work.
Right.
By the time that we see that most of the people or most of their family members are killed by Taliban, it's not the time to say that, okay, let's put aside Afghanistan or it's not a top agenda for us and focus on other issues. But it's the important or critical time that the world should put most of their attention to Afghanistan and find a solution to get out of this condition. We should not wait like until 2001 that Afghanistan poses a threat to international security or other state interests. So on that time, that international community will think, okay, let's start and do something for Afghanistan. No, it's the time that we should start and avoid like a future disaster or catastrophe which is coming to people.
Imtiaz, Wajiha mentioned the talks, dating back to 2020. You were one who said that this was going to be Taliban 2.0. You believed that. You admit now, though, that it is not. And in fact, the Taliban has delivered on none of the expectations that even Pakistan held out for it. So what do you think should happen now? I mean, how should they be treated if the world is going to refuse to recognize them as the legitimate government, yet they're not going anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Taliban disproved almost 99% of the people who had hoped that Taliban 2.0 would be much, much better, lenient, and not as rigid as they had been earlier. But unfortunately, this has been a sad regression from optimism to pessimism, as well as a sense of helplessness vis-a-vis a regime that is becoming more and more inclusive, is sliding into a silo, and just using the Islamic Sharia as well as its tribal traditions to defend what it is doing. And the Hobson's choice, the problem for the world is that it cannot disengage. It cannot afford to disengage in a situation wherein millions of people are desperate. They're starving. They're without education, without work. So what should the international community do? Slap more sanctions, disengage. That means leaving these millions at the mercy of hunger, as well as at the mercy of a regime that refuses to accept the globally accepted norms for women, for girls. So that is an extremely intricate situation even for Pakistan itself, which got a lot of flack for having supported the Taliban politically. And now even they don't listen to Pakistan, despite all the good efforts that Pakistan did, hosting them, connecting them with the United States, with the rest of the global community. But what we see is a regression and more decision-making centered in Kandahar, that is the spiritual capital of the Taliban. So that is a quandary, a dilemma. However, I don't think, and we've been discussing this with a number of British, US, UN officials, privately they say there is the disengagement or more sanctions are possibly off the table as of now, just because it would be like a punch which would come in the face of the deserving, starving, jobless Afghan people.
Right. So, Emran, I mean, what do you see as the options here? And what are the consequences if the world just does not engage the Taliban? Not just for those inside Afghanistan, but for regional neighbors and others.
Well, I think it's now obvious that it's a very, very sad and desperate situation. And we should be honest, we will not find an ultimate answer now how to do it, how to solve it. But the thing is that what we have seen during the last 2 years almost is that the Western world, which intervened in Afghanistan for 2 decades, decided to forget its people after its chaotic withdrawal in August 2021. It decided to punish all the Afghan people for the outcome of the war, although the negotiations and everything that took place in the context of it was not any decision which was made by the Afghan people themselves. It was just the Americans who thought, okay, let's finish the longest war, let's leave the war, let's leave Afghanistan, and do not care about the outcome, especially since the war in Ukraine started, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We can see that there is even much less interest.
Okay, Emran, let me just ask you though quickly, I mean, would Afghanistan have been better off if the Taliban were just left in power? I mean, is this a government that has to be there somehow, given the history of Afghanistan pre the US invasion?
Yes, listen, I mean, the thing is that when we saw the negotiations starting in Doha and other places around the world, the Americans and many other political actors, political players came to the conclusion that we need an inclusive government. We need everyone here. The basic mistake which was being made in 2001 when the Americans invaded was that everyone was included in the government except of the broken Taliban, which were much weaker back then than they are now. It would have been much more easier to negotiate with them back then, but leading political players, including the Karzai government and all different warlords who played a role in it, were not interested in doing that. What happened? The Americans decided to fight ghosts. They attacked villages, they killed civilians, and this increased Taliban support.
I have to ask Wajiha about that, though. I mean, given the ideologues that the Taliban truly is, and hearing Emran say that it would have been easier to negotiate with them in a weakened state, I'm not convinced it would have been. Are you, Wajiha? Because the truth is they make promises and they just will not keep them because of their ideological vision of what Afghanistan should be. Any promise they make, especially when it comes to women's rights, would you ever trust them?
Considering what Imran said, I totally agree with him that one of the key issues in a constitution making process and a post-conflict status is the inclusiveness of the process, in which in the Abraham agreement, like the process that it laid down for constitution making in Afghanistan, or interim government in Afghanistan, sidelined this aspect. That's why we are seeing most of the aspects or consequences of those agreements in 2001 back now in here, and people are paying for that. With regards to the promises and the statements that Taliban are making from the very beginning, when they started to seize the power, they were like providing some hopes for people that, okay, they are not the same as the 20 years or 2 decades back. But what they did was like controversial, what they were saying and what they were doing. Even their leaders' speeches were in contradiction with each other. That's why, as a young woman who was suffered or a victim of the war and who was lost my degree in Afghanistan, I left my homeland and I like just become a refugee with a refugee status, I would never agree or trust what promises they are making, because we have to see what they are doing. It's not only in terms of issuing statements, because they have issued different statements like opening the school doors. People waited, girls were waiting, but suddenly they said that no, we have to change the policy.
Yeah, exactly.
Like how much time it takes for them to just reform an educational policy for a school, while like who will compensate this back 2 years for a girl who is stayed at home, for a girl who cannot go to school, for a girl who is seeing that her brother is going to school but he is hopeless? Like who will pay? How will we can like compensate and reparate this damages?
Right. I mean, Imtiaz, looking forward now, and then looking back, because the question is, was that opportunity lost to, in a sense, negotiate with what would have been a weaker Taliban, and now the only option is to have civilians pay for this damage with their lives, because now they are stuck with something because of that lost opportunity in negotiations however long ago? Or is there something that can be done going forward?
Yeah, it's very little that can be done at the moment other than engaging with the Taliban, unfreezing the funds, removing the banking sanctions on Afghanistan, because
But does engaging with the Taliban on those lines mean empowering the Taliban as well?
Well, I mean, you like it or not, but engaging would also mean appeasing them into a situation in which it would be like a quid pro quo, that you give them something, so they in return then you perhaps can pressurize them for easing life for women, for girls, for their employment. But the problem is, unless the international community now unfreezes their banking, their funds, it will be very difficult to extract anything. However, we should also remember that $40 to $45 million are flowing into Afghanistan in terms of humanitarian aid. That is barely enough to keep the people just above water. But what Afghanistan needs is a big investment in the infrastructure for the revival of the economy. And that would not come without lifting of critical sanctions that are related to the United States and the United Nations.
Emran, final minute, would engaging the way Imtiaz has described, would that be the only way forward, or could it backfire?
I mean, it's as Imtiaz said, there is not much at the moment that we can do. We can hope for it, but yeah, the international community already appeased the Taliban a lot, and the people who suffered for that were the Afghan people. I mean, and it's also often on the ground in very paradox. Last week, I talked to an Afghan medic who's working in Mazar-e-Sharif. He told me that some Taliban fighter called him and said, please, sir, help me to find a female doctor for my wife. And then he answered, what are you talking about? There are not many female doctors, and not especially the one you like now. And there will also not be any in future if you continue being like that. And then this young fighter was angry himself and said, yeah, I don't agree with this policy, but what should I do? And yeah, didn't have any answer. And that's what I can now offer. I don't have a final answer. I think that
seems no
at
one
the
does.
end, we have to engage somehow
for
the people.
Emran Feroz, that will have to be the final word for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us. And our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.